It was just another evening in Washington, D.C., the kind of night where the air feels heavy after a light drizzle. The streets glistened under the dim glow of streetlights, and the city seemed to hum with its usual rhythm. People rushing home, cars rolling by, and the occasional chatter of late-night walkers. On this particular Thursday, a man walked quietly along the sidewalk, his steps steady and unhurried. He wasn't flashy or loud. He blended into the background like someone who didn't want to be noticed. And that's exactly what he wanted. This man had spent most of his day inside the grand halls of the Supreme Court, buried deep in work. His desk was cluttered with papers, legal briefs, and notes scribbled in neat handwriting. For hours he had been thinking about a big case, one that could change how people were treated across the country. It was the kind of responsibility that weighed heavily on him, but it also gave him purpose. After finishing up, he decided to take a walk instead of driving. Walking helped him think, clear his mind, and connect with the world outside those marble walls. He stopped at a small corner store to grab a bottle of water. It wasn't anything fancy, just a quick pit stop before heading back to his quiet apartment nearby. As he stepped out of the store holding the plastic bag with his purchase, he noticed two police officers approaching. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, bouncing off the wet pavement as they moved closer. One of them called out, "Sir, we need you to stop right there." The man froze. There was no panic in his face, no sudden jolt of fear. Instead, he stood still, waiting patiently to hear what they wanted. To anyone watching, he looked calm, almost too calm for someone being approached by the police late at night. But inside his mind was racing. Why were they stopping him? What did they want? As the officers got closer, one of them asked, "What are you doing here?" The tone wasn't friendly, it was sharp, demanding. The man replied simply, "I'm just walking home, I live around here." His voice was soft but firm, the kind of voice that commands respect without raising its volume. One of the officers glanced at the bag in his hand, then asked for ID. Without hesitation, the man reached into his pocket and handed over his driver's license. The officer squinted at it, then looked back at the man standing in front of him. Something didn't add up. Or maybe it did, depending on how you looked at it. The man fit the description of someone reported earlier. Tall, wearing a coat, carrying a bag. Vague details, sure, but enough to raise suspicion. Then came the moment that changed everything. When the officer peered into the man's bag, he spotted something small and metallic, a tiny pocket knife. It wasn't a weapon, not really. Just a simple tool, something the man carried because it reminded him of his father. But in that instant, the situation shifted. The officers became more alert, their body language tense. They told him to step away from the bag and put his hands up. People passing by began to slow down, curious about what was happening. Some whispered to each other, while others pulled out their phones to record the scene. The man remained silent, his expression unreadable. He didn't argue or resist, he just followed instructions, letting the events unfold without saying much. What these officers didn't know, and what the crowd gathering around them couldn't guess, was that this quiet man wasn't just any ordinary citizen. He was someone whose decisions shaped laws, whose words carried weight, and whose presence commanded respect in the highest courts of the land. But none of that mattered in this moment. All that mattered was the color of his skin, the time of night, and the assumptions swirling in the minds of those around him. For the man, it wasn't anger that filled him as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. It was sadness, a deep, aching sadness that came from knowing this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a story repeated countless times in different places, with different faces. But tonight, it was happening to him. And, though he knew who he was, he kept quiet, choosing to let the moment play out as it would. Little did anyone know this quiet arrest would spark conversations far beyond that damp street corner. It would force people to confront uncomfortable truths and ask questions they might have otherwise ignored. But for now, all that existed was the sound of raindrops hitting the pavement and the flashing lights of a police car illuminating the night. The officers weren't exactly gentle as they led the man to their patrol car. One of them gripped his arm firmly, while the other kept glancing around, scanning the growing crowd of onlookers. The man didn't resist or argue. He simply walked. Where they directed him, his face unreadable. If he felt any fear or frustration, he didn't show it. Instead, he seemed almost detached, like he was watching the scene unfold from a distance, observing every detail with quiet precision. As they drove away, the flashing lights of the police car reflected off the wet streets, casting eerie shadows through the windows. The man sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him, staring out at the city he knew so well. It was strange, almost surreal to see it this way, from the inside of a police car, as if he were someone else entirely. He wasn't angry, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong about all of this. When they arrived at the precinct, the man was taken inside and processed like any other suspect. A desk sergeant barked orders asking for his name, address, and date of birth. He answered each question calmly, his voice steady and measured. There was no hint of arrogance or defensiveness in his tone, just simple cooperation. But even as he spoke, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him, not like this. Things took a turn when one of the officers noticed something unusual. The ID the man had handed over earlier listed an address near the Supreme Court. That alone might not have raised eyebrows, but then another officer recognized the name. "Wait a second," he muttered, pulling up a quick search on his phone. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the results. Is this who I think it is?" Whispers spread quickly through the room. At first, no one wanted to believe it. How could someone so important, someone whose decisions shaped the very fabric of the law, end up in handcuffs over a misunderstanding? But as more people checked the facts, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't just any man. It was the man, the one whose opinions carried the weight of history itself. Panic set in almost immediately. The desk sergeant froze mid-question, his pen hovering awkwardly above the paperwork. Officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. Someone called the chief of police, who arrived within minutes, visibly flustered. By now, word had leaked outside the station, and reporters began gathering outside, drawn by rumors of an extraordinary arrest. Inside, the chief approached the man, who was still seated calmly, waiting patiently for whatever came next. "Sir," the chief said, his voice trembling slightly, I apologize for this. We had no idea." He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. The man nodded slowly, accepting the apology without hesitation. "It's all right," he said softly. "Mistakes happen." But there was something in his tone, a subtle firmness that made everyone pause. This wasn't just forgiveness, it was understanding. He knew better than anyone how systems worked, how assumptions could lead to errors, and how those errors could ripple outward, affecting lives in ways both big and small. Still, he chose not to dwell on the personal insult. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture, the lessons that could be learned from this moment. Before long, calls started pouring in from powerful figures across the country. Senators, lawyers, and even members of the White House demanded answers. How had this happened? Who was responsible? Could something like this really occur in broad daylight, or rather under the cover of night? For the officers involved, the realization hit hard. They hadn't meant for any of this to happen. They were just doing their jobs, responding to a vague report of suspicious activity. But now, faced with the reality of their mistake, they couldn't help but feel ashamed. One of them, a younger cop barely out of training, looked pale and shaken. Another, older and more seasoned, kept muttering apologies under his breath, though he knew words wouldn't fix anything. Meanwhile, the man remained composed, almost unnervingly so. When offered a chance to leave, he declined at first, insisting on going through the proper channels. Only after it became clear that the process had been expedited did he agree to step outside. As he walked out of the precinct, cameras flashed, capturing his expressionless face for the world to see. Reporters shouted questions, but he ignored them, climbing into a waiting car without saying a single word. Back at home, the man sat alone in his living room, replaying the events of the night in his mind. He thought about the officers, their initial suspicion, and the way things had spiraled out of control so quickly. He thought about the crowd that had gathered, some of them recording videos, others whispered were endlessly talking among themselves. And he thought about the countless others who had been in similar situations, people who didn't have the luxury of walking away unscathed, people whose stories often went untold. This wasn't about him. He understood that. It never had been. What mattered now was what happened next, the conversations that would follow, the changes that might or might not come. For tonight, though, he let himself sit quietly, letting the silence speak louder than any words ever could. The man returned home late that night, his apartment quiet and dimly lit. He didn't turn on the lights right away, choosing instead to sit by the window, staring out at the city skyline. The streets below were still damp from the earlier rain, and the occasional car headlights cast fleeting reflections on the glass. For a long time he just sat there, letting the silence wrap around him like a heavy blanket. His mind kept replaying the events of the evening, the flashing police lights, the sharp commands, the whispers of the crowd. It wasn't anger that filled him. It was something deeper, quieter, but no less powerful. He thought about the officers who had arrested him. They weren't bad people, not really. They were doing their jobs, responding to a call based on vague details. But that was the problem. It was always the little things, the small assumptions that snowballed into something much bigger. He knew this better than most. Over the years, he had seen countless cases where someone's life was turned upside down because of a misunderstanding, a stereotype, or a split-second decision made in haste. Tonight it had happened to him. And while he could walk away from it all unscathed, he couldn't ignore the weight of what it meant for others who weren't so fortunate. As he sat there, his eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the wall. It was an old picture, faded with time, showing two people smiling warmly at the camera, his parents. They had come from humble beginnings, working hard to give him opportunities they never had. His father had been a preacher, a man of deep faith who believed in justice and fairness even when the world seemed determined to deny it. His mother had been a teacher, instilling in him the value of education and the importance of standing up for what was right. Together, they had taught him resilience, patience, and grace, qualities that had carried him through some of the toughest moments of his life. Thinking about them now brought a lump to his throat. He wondered what they would say if they could see him tonight. Would they be proud of how he handled himself? Or would they feel the same sadness he did, knowing that decades after their struggles, the fight was still far from over? Eventually, he got up and walked to his desk. It was cluttered with papers, books, and notes, a testament to the long hours he spent poring over legal documents and drafting opinions. Sitting down, he picked up a pen and began to write. At first, the words came slowly, each one carefully chosen. But as he continued, the thoughts flowed more freely, spilling onto the page in a steady stream. He wrote about the arrest, not to dwell on the humiliation or the injustice of it, but to reflect on what it revealed about the world we live in. He wrote about the systemic issues that allowed such mistakes to happen, not just to him, but to countless others whose stories rarely made headlines. And he wrote about hope, about the possibility of change, however distant it might seem. By the time he finished, the sun was beginning its slow rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, reading over what he had written. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That was what mattered most. Later that morning, news of the arrest spread like wildfire. Social media erupted with posts, memes, and heated debates. Some praised the man for his composure and dignity, calling him a symbol of strength and resilience. Others criticized him for not speaking out sooner, accusing him of staying silent to protect his image. Meanwhile, news outlets scrambled to piece together the story, interviewing witnesses, experts, and even the officers involved. The incident dominated headlines, sparking conversations across dinner tables, classrooms, and boardrooms. At the precinct, the fallout was immediate. The officers who had made the arrest were placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Their colleagues walked on eggshells, unsure of what to say or do. The chief of police held a press conference, apologizing profusely and promising reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. "We failed," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Not just him, but everyone who trusts us to uphold the law fairly and without bias." For the man, though, the public reaction was secondary. He didn't care about the praise or the criticism. What mattered to him was the opportunity this moment presented, an opening to talk about the deeper issues at play. He knew that apologies and promises of reform were only the beginning. Real change required action, commitment, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and he intended to use his platform to push for exactly that. Over the next few days, he received calls and messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Some offered support, sharing their own stories of discrimination and profiling. Others vented their frustrations, urging him to take legal action or demand accountability. He listened to each one patiently, thanking them for reaching out but offering few details about his plans. He wasn't ready to share yet, not until he had clarity about what needed to be said and how best to say it. In the meantime, life went on. He attended meetings, reviewed cases, and continued his work as if nothing had happened. To those who didn't know him personally, it might have seemed like he had moved past the incident entirely. But those close to him noticed subtle changes, a slight heaviness in his gaze, a pause before answering certain questions. It was clear that the experience had left its mark, shaping his perspective in ways that would influence his decisions moving forward. One evening, as he prepared for bed, he found himself standing in front of the mirror. The reflection staring back at him looked tired but resolute. He thought about the speech he had drafted, the words he planned to share with the world. It wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback, resistance, and perhaps even hostility. But he also knew that silence was never an option. Not for someone in his position, and certainly not for someone who believed in the power of justice to transform lives. With that thought, he turned off the light and climbed into bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And for now, that was enough. The day of the speech arrived, and the courtroom was packed. People filled every seat, some sitting on the floor or standing along the walls just to be there. Reporters with notepads and cameras lined the back of the room, their lenses trained on the bench where he would soon appear. Outside, crowds gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "Accountability Now." The energy in the air was electric, a mix of anticipation and tension. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary address. It was something bigger, something that could ripple through the nation. When he finally entered the room, the murmurs died down almost instantly. He walked slowly, deliberately, his steps measured and calm. There was no grand entrance, no dramatic gestures, just a quiet confidence that demanded attention. As he took his place at the podium, the room fell completely silent. For a moment, he simply stood there looking out at the sea of faces before him. Some were familiar, lawyers, colleagues, friends, but many were strangers, people who had come because they wanted answers, or maybe just hope. He began by recounting the events of that night, his voice steady but soft, like he was telling a story to a close friend. He didn't embellish or dramatize. He stuck to the facts. He talked about the officers stopping him, the confusion that followed, and the moment when the handcuffs clicked into place. His tone never wavered. He wasn't seeking pity or trying to stir up anger. Instead, he spoke as if he were sharing someone else's experience, keeping the focus on what it all meant rather than how it made him feel. Then he paused. The silence stretched for a few seconds, long enough for everyone to lean forward slightly, hanging on his next words. When he spoke again, his voice carried more weight, each sentence landing like a stone dropped into still water. "What happened to me that night wasn't unique," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It wasn't special, it wasn't rare. It happens every day to people who don't have titles, who don't wear robes, who don't have access to power or privilege. And that's why we need to talk about it." The room seemed to hold its breath. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the reporter stopped scribbling for a moment, captivated by the raw honesty in his words. He went on to explain how easy it was for assumptions to take root, for biases to shape decisions without anyone even realizing it. He spoke about the dangers of profiling, not just in policing but in schools, workplaces, and communities. He didn't point fingers or assign blame. He simply laid out the truth, letting the weight of his words sink in. But he didn't stop there. He shifted gears, turning his focus to solutions. We can't fix everything overnight, he admitted, but we can start. We can train officers to see people as individuals, not stereotypes. We can hold ourselves accountable when we make mistakes. And we can listen to those who've been hurt, to those who've been ignored, to those who've been told their voices don't matter. His voice grew stronger as he continued, rising above the hushed tones of the earlier part of the speech. Justice isn't just about laws or courts or verdicts. It's about fairness. It's about dignity. It's about treating every person, no matter who they are or where they come from, with the respect they deserve. By the time he finished, the room was utterly silent. For a few seconds, no one clapped or cheered. They just sat there, absorbing what they'd heard. Then slowly the applause began. It started with a few hesitant hands, then grew louder and more unified until the entire room erupted. Some people stood, tears streaming down their faces. Others nodded silently, their expressions thoughtful and reflective. It was clear that something had shifted, not just in the room but in the hearts and minds of everyone present. Outside, the reaction was just as powerful. Social media lit up with clips of the speech, hashtags trending within minutes. News outlets played excerpts on repeat, analyzing every line, every pause, every glance. Commentators debated its impact while ordinary citizens shared their thoughts online. Some praised him for his courage and clarity, calling the speech a turning point. Others pushed back, arguing that words alone weren't enough, that real change required action, not just rhetoric. For the man himself, though, the response was secondary. He hadn't given the speech for applause or headlines. He had done it because he believed it needed to be said. That evening, as he returned home, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, satisfaction, but also a lingering sense of responsibility. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Words could inspire, but they couldn't enforce. Real progress would require effort, from lawmakers, from communities, from individuals willing to confront uncomfortable truths. That night, he sat in his study, flipping through old case files and legal documents. On the desk beside him was a stack of letters people had sent after hearing about the arrest. Some were angry, venting their frustrations about systemic injustice. Others were hopeful, thanking him for shining a light on issues they had long felt powerless to address. Each one reminded him of why he did what he did, not for fame or recognition, but because he believed in the possibility of a better future. As he read through the letters, his mind drifted back to his parents. He imagined them sitting across from him, nodding approvingly at the work he was doing. They wouldn't sugarcoat things, they never had. But they would remind him to keep going, to stay grounded, to remember the people whose lives depended on the choices he made. Eventually, he set the letters aside and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new debates, new opportunities to push for change. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the struggles, the victories, the lessons learned along the way. And he thought about the path ahead, knowing full well that it wouldn't always be smooth. But as he climbed into bed and closed his eyes, one thing was certain: he was ready. In the weeks that followed the speech, the nation seemed to hold its collective breath. Conversations that had been simmering beneath the surface for years suddenly boiled over, spilling into living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces. People who had never thought much about policing or racial profiling found themselves drawn into debates they couldn't ignore. Social media feeds were flooded with posts, some thoughtful, some heated, but all of them pointing toward a shared desire for change. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what his story represented. For many, the arrest and subsequent speech became a mirror, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own biases and assumptions. Parents talked to their kids about fairness and respect. Teachers used the incident as a lesson in empathy and accountability. Even politicians, often hesitant to wade into controversial topics, began speaking out, calling for reforms that ranged from revising police training programs to addressing broader systemic inequalities. The man's words had struck a chord, resonating far beyond the courtroom where he'd delivered them, but not everyone agreed on what should come next. While some praised him for sparking a national dialogue, others criticized him for not going far enough. Activists argued that speeches alone wouldn't fix broken systems. They wanted concrete actions, policies, and measurable outcomes. Skeptics dismissed the entire episode as an isolated incident, insisting it was being blown out of proportion. And then there were those who pushed back against the very idea of discussing bias at all, claiming such conversations only divided people further. Amidst the noise, the man stayed focused. He didn't engage in public arguments or respond to critics directly. Instead, he continued doing what he did best, working quietly behind the scenes to push for meaningful change. He met with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and policymakers, listening more than he spoke. When asked for his opinion during these meetings, he offered suggestions rooted in practicality rather than ideology. "We can't rewrite history," he often said, "but we can shape the future." And that starts with small, deliberate steps. One of his first initiatives was to advocate for better training programs for police officers. These weren't just lectures or PowerPoint presentations. They were immersive experiences designed to help officers see the world through someone else's eyes. Role-playing exercises, virtual reality simulations, and candid discussions with members of marginalized communities became part of the curriculum. The goal wasn't to shame or blame, but to foster understanding. "If you know someone's story," he explained during one meeting, "it's harder to stereotype them." At the same time, he worked with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at increasing transparency within law enforcement. Body cameras, data collection, and independent oversight boards became key components of the proposed reforms. Critics argued that these measures would hinder officers' ability to do their jobs effectively, but supporters countered that accountability and trust went hand in hand. "You can't have one without the other," he told a group of senators during a private briefing. And right now, trust is in short supply. The impact of his efforts extended beyond policy changes. Across the country, grassroots movements gained momentum, inspired by his example. In small towns and big cities alike, people organized marches, town hall meetings, and workshops. Some groups focused on education, hosting seminars to teach bystanders how to intervene safely during encounters with law enforcement. Others concentrated on storytelling, creating platforms for individuals to share their own experiences of injustice. What united them all was a shared belief that change was possible, and that it started with ordinary people taking extraordinary steps. Even within the police force, attitudes began to shift. Many officers felt defensive at first, resistant to the idea that they might be part of the problem. But as training programs rolled out and personal stories emerged, some started to see things differently. One officer, a veteran with over 2 decades of service, admitted during a panel discussion that he had always prided himself on treating everyone fairly. Yet after participating in a role-playing exercise where he played the role of a suspect, he realized how intimidating his presence could be, even when he didn't intend it to be. "It made me rethink how I approach situations," he said, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "I don't want anyone to feel the way I felt in that moment." Back home, the man kept a low profile despite the growing attention surrounding his work. He attended events sparingly, preferring to let others take center stage. Friends noticed subtle changes in him, though. There was a new spark in his eyes, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. He still spent long hours in his study, poring over legal documents and drafting opinions, but now he included handwritten notes in the margins, reminders to consider the human side of every case. "Justice isn't abstract," he wrote in one margin. "It's lived." Despite the progress, challenges remained. Not everyone embraced the reforms, and resistance came from unexpected places. Some departments resisted adopting new training methods, citing budget constraints or logistical hurdles. Others dragged their feet on implementing transparency measures, arguing that they needed more time to evaluate the proposals. Meanwhile, political divisions threatened to stall legislative efforts altogether. For every step forward, it sometimes felt like 2 steps back. But the man refused to lose hope. He knew that change rarely happened overnight or without struggle. During moments of doubt, he reminded himself of why he had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't for recognition or applause. It was because he believed in the power of justice to transform lives, not just for individuals, but for entire communities. And if he could play even a small role in making that vision a reality, he considered it time well spent. One evening, as he prepared dinner in his modest kitchen, he reflected on how far things had come since that rainy night. The memory of the handcuffs clicking around his wrists still lingered, but it no longer carried the same sting. Instead, it served as a reminder of the work that lay ahead, and the responsibility he carried to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure similar experiences. As he sat down to eat, he glanced at the framed photograph of his parents on the wall. They had taught him so much about resilience, faith, and the importance of standing up for what was right. He smiled softly, imagining their proud faces looking back at him. Then, setting aside his plate, he picked up a pen and began jotting down ideas for his next project. Change was slow, but it was also relentless, and he intended to keep pushing 1 step at a time. Months turned into years, and the man's quiet determination became a steady force for change. While the initial wave of attention had eventually faded from the headlines, the impact of his actions continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways both big and small. The reforms he had championed, better training programs, increased transparency, and community-driven initiatives, slowly took root in cities and towns across the country. Officers began wearing body cameras as standard practice. Independent oversight boards reviewed complaints with greater scrutiny, and more importantly, conversations about fairness and bias became normalized, not just in policy circles, but in everyday life. For many people, the man himself remained something of an enigma. He avoided the spotlight, rarely giving interviews, or making public appearances beyond official duties. When reporters tried to track him down, they often found themselves staring at closed doors or receiving polite but firm rejections. Yet his presence loomed large nonetheless, a symbol of resilience, dignity, and unwavering commitment to justice. People didn't need to see him on television or hear his voice to know that he was still working tirelessly behind the scenes, shaping decisions and influencing policies that would affect generations to come. One of the most profound changes came not in laws or institutions, but in individual hearts and minds. Stories began emerging from unexpected places, stories of officers who had changed the way they approached their jobs, of citizens who felt safer interacting with law enforcement, of communities coming together to bridge divides that once seemed insurmountable. A young mother shared how her teenage son, stopped by police while walking home late one night, was treated with respect instead of suspicion. An elderly man recounted how a traffic stop ended not with tension, but with a conversation about local schools. These weren't grand gestures or headline-grabbing moments. They were small, human interactions that added up to something much bigger. Even within the Supreme Court, his influence grew. His colleagues noticed a shift in the way he wrote opinions, not just in the legal reasoning, which had always been sharp and precise, but in the underlying tone. There was a warmth to his words now, a sense that he was speaking directly to the people whose lives would be impacted by each ruling. Laws exist to protect humanity, he wrote in one landmark decision, not the other way around. That phrase resonated deeply, becoming a rallying cry for advocates pushing for compassionate, people-centered policies. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Resistance persisted, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. Some departments resisted adopting new practices, citing cost or logistical challenges. Others implemented reforms half-heartedly, going through the motions without truly embracing the spirit of change. Critics argued that progress was too slow, that incremental steps weren't enough to address systemic issues. And there were setbacks, cases, where old patterns resurfaced, reminding everyone that change required constant vigilance. Through it all, the man stayed grounded. He understood better than anyone that transformation didn't happen overnight. It was messy, imperfect, and often frustrating. But he also believed in the power of persistence. Every meeting, every letter, every late-night brainstorming session brought them closer to the goal, even if the finish line remained distant. He drew strength from the stories of those who had inspired him along the way. Activists fighting for equality, teachers nurturing young minds, parents raising children to believe in a brighter future. In quieter moments, he allowed himself to reflect on what this journey had meant for him personally. The arrest that had started it all had left scars, though not the kind you could see. Sometimes, when walking alone at night, he'd catch himself glancing over his shoulder, a reflex born of that uneasy evening. Other times, he'd pause mid-conversation, reminded of the fragility of trust. But these moments didn't weigh him down. They fueled him, reinforcing his belief that no one should have to carry such burdens alone. As the years passed, historians began documenting his legacy. They wrote books, produced documentaries, and held symposiums analyzing his contributions to law and society. Scholars debated whether his greatest achievement was the specific policies he helped implement or the broader cultural shift he ignited. For ordinary citizens, however, the answer was simpler. To them, he wasn't just a jurist or a reformer. He was proof that even in the face of injustice, hope could prevail. That even when systems failed, individuals could rise above. And that true leadership wasn't about titles or power. It was about service. Eventually, the day came when he decided to step back from public life. Age had caught up with him, and though his mind remained sharp, his body told him it was time to rest. He announced his retirement quietly with little fanfare. No grand speeches, no farewell tours, just a brief statement thanking those who had supported him throughout his career. The announcement sent shockwaves through the legal community, but the general public responded with gratitude rather than grief. They knew his work would endure long after he stepped away. On his final day in office, he walked out of the courthouse alone, carrying nothing but a leather briefcase and a folded umbrella. Reporters waited outside, hoping for a quote or a photo opportunity, but he simply smiled and waved before disappearing into the crowd. Later that evening, he sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of papers and books. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. He picked up a pen and began writing, a habit he'd never lost, even in retirement. This time, though, he wasn't drafting an opinion or outlining policy proposals. Instead, he wrote a letter to the next generation. In it, he shared lessons learned over decades of service. The importance of listening, the value of humility, the courage required to confront uncomfortable truths. Change is hard, he wrote, but it's worth it. Don't wait for someone else to lead. You have everything you need to make a difference. Trust yourself, trust others, and never stop believing in the possibility of a better world. When he finished, he sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in a drawer alongside mementos from his life, photos of his parents, awards he'd received, notes from colleagues and friends. Then for the first time in years, he turned off the light and went to bed early. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual energy, oblivious to the quiet milestone that had just been reached. Years later, when historians looked back on his life, they would point to that rainy Thursday night as a turning point, not just for him but for the nation. It was the moment when a single incident forced a collective reckoning, sparking conversations that might otherwise have remained unspoken. But perhaps the most enduring lesson was this: justice isn't something handed down from above. It's built from the ground up, shaped by the choices we make every day. And while no one person can fix everything, each of us has the power to leave the world a little better than we found it. That, in the end, was his greatest gift. Not the reforms, or the speeches, but the reminder that real change begins with seeing each other clearly.